Welcome back to the channel. My name's Claire. Today we're talking about bias binding, specifically how to cut your fabric on the bias and then how to use this bias binding kit that I got from Amazon. And if you stay till later in the video, I will have a full demo for you. So let's get into it. So the first question to ask ourselves, what is bias binding? Bias binding is a strip of fabric that is cut on the bias. So you've got your warped and you've got your weft. I do hope I got that right. And then you've got your bias on a 45-degree angle, and it's that bias that stretches out. So bias binding is mostly used in quilting, but you do use it in garment sewing as well, mainly for stitching the neckline, maybe the armhole on a sleeveless top, and sometimes even hems. It's also used for a Hong Kong seam finish, which is where they wrap the bias binding around the seams of the fabric to finish it. So why is it used? Bias binding is used because it has that stretch that I spoke about, which makes it ideal for curving around seams such as this scoop neckline I've got here. And you can actually manipulate the fabric under the iron as well. And as you iron it, you will turn it. So you turn it into a curve, which helps it even further. And it's ideal for finishing for that reason. So shop bought or DIY. So you can buy it in a shop pre-made, and that can be an option, particularly if you're new to sewing or you just want to do a hem or a neckline really quickly, then that can be a good option for you. But depending on where you bought it, how much it costs, what it's made of, the weight of it, will all determine whether it is a good fit for the garment that you're making. To be honest, it can be a bit of a lottery buying ready-made bias binding as to whether it's going to be any good or not. I tend to make my own, but if you found a shop bought one that you really like, then stick with that, I would say. In my experience, the cheaper you spend money on bias binding, the less likely it is to actually be cut on the bias, and that's what you need. The stretchiness is the main feature of bias binding. Otherwise you could just cut strips of fabric. I bought these reels of bias binding off eBay that you can see on screen now, and they're not cut on the bias. There's just no way. I made a Helen's Closet dungaree, I can't remember the name. So I made my toile using this bias binding, and it had a really steep curve and it just was no good for it. This kind of bias binding, cheap bias binding, is fine if you just want to cut on a straight grain, maybe on your hem or something like that, but I would not use it for any curves. I really feel, to be on the safe side, that we're best off making our own. And the benefits of making our own is we can make it in the same fabric as the fabric we're using, or a coordinating one, but the weight should be much better for the garment that we're sewing. There will be times when you want a heavier weight or a lighter weight, and you can make those decisions based on the fabric that you're going to use. When you're new to sewing, it can be really daunting, the idea of making your own bias binding, but I'm going to completely debunk that today, because I'm going to show you just how easy it is, especially if you use the kit that I'm going to show you. The best thing about making your own bias binding is that you can ensure that it's genuinely cut on the bias, and I just think it's going to make a better garment overall. Once you've made it once, you are not going to ever buy shop bought again. That's my view. So the next question is, do I really need a bias binding kit like the one that I mentioned at the start? And that is this one here. Put some B-roll over. But basically you get all of this in here. So you've got 4 bias binding tool makers, and they just are different sizes. You've got a bias binding foot that I will show you in a bit closer detail during the demo. You get a few pins and a awl, and actually it's really good. I paid $15 or $10 for this. It's been one of the best investments I've made in sewing. If you haven't got much money but want it, do consider it an investment, because it is really worth it. Now I will have an affiliate link down below to my Amazon link. I'll have one for the UK and the US, so do consider purchasing through that link if you want to get one, because that will help support the channel and in turn support me. I honestly believe this tool is going to make your life a lot easier when making bias binding, but it's by no means essential. The two main things that you would use it for are creating the bias tape, but you can just fold it and iron it yourself. It just takes a lot longer. And then you've got the bias binding foot as well. When you're wrapping the bias binding around the edge of some fabric, it makes it a lot easier. You do it in half of the time, which you'll see a bit later. One thing to note, this bias binding kit isn't for you if you want to attach bias binding but turn it under. Like I've done here, see I've got bias binding there and it's turned under. Now I wouldn't use this bias binding kit, well I wouldn't use the foot if I was making this. But I would still use the tool to make the tape because that's just, it's saving hours and hours. So now I'm going to take you over to the demo. Just bear in mind that I do have tremors. It's something I've had since I was born and I can't help it, but I do try to omit it from my videos as much as possible because I am very self-conscious about it, but you may see it in the video. So please be kind because I considered not bringing this video to you because of that reason. But I think there's tons of value here for you. So do stick around, have a watch and leave me a comment down below. Let me know if this video was indeed helpful to you. I would love to know. And what are your tips for sewing bias binding? I think the community would really benefit to hear your thoughts on it. So without further ado, let's go over to the demo. So to make some bias binding, you will need some fabric. A yard, half a yard, whatever you've got will be fine. I am making it out of a square of fabric just because it fits on camera a little bit better. You're going to need an iron and an ironing board. You'll need the bias binding kit that I mentioned if you want to follow along exactly as I'm doing it. Otherwise you can iron your bias binding yourself and then just do 2 passes of the sewing. So you're going to need some cutting tools. I'm using a rotary blade and a mat and scissors later on. So you'll need a small piece of card to wrap your bias binding tape around just to keep it a little bit nice. So let's get on and cut out the fabric. So first of all, you'll want to take a corner of the fabric and fold it over to meet the selvage. You'll then see that you've got a long folded edge and that is where the fabric will be cut on the bias. So then you'll want to fold it over and keep folding it over on that bias edge, as you can see I'm doing here. And then you can do it so it's small enough that you want to start cutting it. So first of all, you want to cut off the folded edge, just like maybe 1/4 of an inch away from there, so you've got a real straight edge to work against. Then you want to make strips that are twice as wide as you want the bias binding tape to be. I wanted my bias tape to be 3/4 of an inch, so I cut it at 1.5 inches for each strip. So you can see my strips here and they are quite short, and that's just because I used a small piece of fabric so that I could get it all on camera. But if you use a bigger piece of fabric, you will see some nice long strips here. So now you just need to sew those strips together. So you want to bring the 2 ends together at a 90-degree angle and then sew a line of stitching diagonally so that when you open it up, it's one long strip. Do check it before you sew it because sometimes you might accidentally be sewing on an angle. Do that for all of your strips and then you will have one long piece of bias binding. So next up, we're going to create the bias binding tape. With your ironing board, lay the tape the wrong side up and feed through the larger end of your bias making tool. You will have chosen the correct size for the tape you want to make. The smaller side of the tape maker is how wide your bias tape will come out using that tool. So start pressing with the iron, move the tool along, press some more and keep going until you've completed all of your tape. So now you want to grab that piece of card that I mentioned before and start wrapping your bias tape around it, and this will keep it nice and secure. If you haven't got a piece of card, but you can use anything, maybe a cereal box or something like that, just cut a small piece. But if not, just wrap it around your fingers and then take it off and secure it with a pin and secure the card with a pin as well, and then you've got it stored for when you need it. So now we get onto the foot. So I just want to explain the foot a little bit here. So it has a plastic contraption, I don't know what else to call it, that is attached to a regular metal foot, and then you attach the metal foot to the sewing machine. On the left of this plastic part of the foot, you have 2 slots, as you can see here. You feed your bias binding tape in there and hook the bottom and the top in those little hook areas that you can see that I'm pointing to. Once you've done that, on the right there's a little metal dial, and you turn that and that will secure the bias tape in place depending on how wide the tape is or how thin it is. You've attached it to your machine and it's time to get sewing. So now we need to attach the fabric to the bias binding. This is the fun part. So you fed the bias binding tape through, as I've just explained to you, and now you want to add your fabric. So your fabric will be sandwiched between the bias binding. So I find it a little bit easier to put the fabric in from the back of the machine first into the front. It just seems to stay a little bit better that way. Feed the fabric through the bias foot as explained before. I need to move my bias tape to the left a little bit to make it work for me, but you will need to experiment and see what works for you. Just note that when I was doing it, I did have to stop and start because sometimes the bias tape does come out of the bias tape foot a little bit, but just stop, readjust and continue as you were before. And now you can see how neat and tidy it is in one pass. Absolutely fantastic. I'm very, very happy with this. So I hope you found that super helpful and super interesting. It was a basic overview, so keep that in mind, but it should give you a great starting point with which to use your own tools and just get some confidence to make your own bias binding. I made my own bias binding for this dress here. I did fold it under, so I didn't use the foot, but I did use the bias tape maker, and that made things very easy, especially as it was a slippery fabric. By the way, if you haven't seen my slippery fabric video, do check that out now because that is waiting for you to watch it. If you like this content and you'd like to see more like it, do hit that subscribe button, give me a like because YouTube really loves that. And I will see you in the next one. Happy sewing. Bye for now.